Catholic
bata. Kahit na
Encyclopedia
mataba yung
says,
physical.
one person lacks what is necessary.
Magandang araw mga kasoso. Welcome po sa channel na ito. Sa bidyong ito pag-uusapan natin ang ibig sabihin ng human acts at ang pagkakaiba nito sa acts of man. Morally good actions have certain requirements. To be able to determine in all cases whether a choice being considered is moral, it is necessary to understand what is meant by the object, the intention, and the circumstances of a particular action. Wow! English. Una sa lahat, it is good to remind ourselves that only humans are capable of making moral choices. This is made possible through the intellect, freedom and voluntariness. Aristotle through St. Thomas Aquinas was able to distinguish human act from act of man. Kung titingnan natin, we can hardly see the difference, akala natin wala, pero meron. Human acts or money are actions that proceed from insight into the nature and purpose of one's doing and from consent of free will. These are acts which proceed from insight and free will, and rightly be called personal acts. These are actions, physical, spiritual, internal or external, that proceed from the deliberate free will of man. These are rational and willed actions that are proper only to man, which man does not share with the brutes, actions that require man's rationality. Sa madaling salita, when we speak of human act, there are three things or three elements that must be present. Una, the action must originate from a person having wisdom or knowledge or what we call discernment. Ibig sabihin, the individual must know whether or not the action is good or bad. Pangalawa, it should originate from a person having freedom. The person must be free. Dapat malaya ka at malaya mong ginagawa. If the person is not free, it can never be a human act. Kaya sa mga di malaya dyan ang hirap, di ba? Pangatlo, the action must originate from person with voluntariness or will. Ano nga ba ang pagkakaiba ng freedom at voluntariness maliban sa spelling? Freedom means you can choose whether to do it or not. When we say voluntariness naman, are you willing to do it? Do you have the willingness to do it? Ganon po. Now, talking about act of man, if one of the elements is absent, we call it act of man. In short, acts of man are man's actions which man shares with the animals. These are the acts of perception or sensation, halimbawa, the beating of the heart, blood circulation in the body, digestion of the goods in the stomach, blinking of the eyes at iba pa. Acts of man are actions that proceed without man's deliberate free will. This is why actions that happen within the body are not human acts because they occur without the control of the will and the consciousness of the human mind. Acts of man do not only mean actions that happen inside the body but also those that occur outside the body. These are actions done by infants, the insane, imbeciles, morons. Actions that are done when one is asleep are also acts of man. Halimbawa, nakatulog ka tapos sa panaginip mo, naghahalikan kayo ng kasyel mo, also known as ka-baby mo. Tapos nagulat yung katabi mo kasi nagliliikot na yung kamay mo sa kanya. Or, habang tulog ka, nagsasalita ka ng mga bagay-bagay. There are three elements of human acts. We also call these as the constituents of human acts. Alamin natin ta. The first one is knowledge. Doing an act with knowledge makes the act deliberate. Ibig sabihin, the agent or doer has intellectual knowledge of the act, has awareness of the means to employ as he performs the act, and has also the awareness of the end to achieve in his action. Pangalawa is freedom. Mga kapatid sa pananamantala, brothers and sisters in crisis, every human act is done with freedom. An act done with freedom means that the agent does an act under the control of his will. Gets ba? If the agent used his freedom, his will is not affected or influenced by any constraint either within himself or outside himself. He is not forced to do or not to do a particular action. Ang panghuli ay voluntariness. This requires the other two constituents, the knowledge and freedom. It is synonymous with human act. Voluntary act is a willful act. Acts of man or actus hominis are actions performed without intervention of intellect and free will. It comprises all spontaneous biological and sensual processes, like nutrition, breathing, sensual impressions. These are actions which merely happen in the body or through the body without the awareness of the mind or the control of the will. Human act is any act, thought, or word that is done with full knowledge at deliberate. Human actions are good, moral, when they have the moral perfections and fullness required by the object of the actions. Example, when human acts agree with the standards or norms of morality which are human reason, conscience and natural law. Human actions are evil, immoral, when they are contrary to the moral perfections required by the object of the action. Human actions are non-moral or amoral naman when it has no relation to morality. Halimbawa, when human acts are performed by those who lack the moral sense of responsibility, like infants and insane people. If the agent has greater knowledge, freedom and voluntariness, the agent has greater responsibility for the consequences of the act. In contrast, if the agent has lesser knowledge, freedom and voluntariness, the agent has lesser responsibility for the act. Now, let us talk about the modifiers of human acts. Pag sinabi nating modifiers, modify means nakakaapekto, nakakabago sa kilos ng tao. Kapag ang kilos ng tao ay with knowledge, freedom and voluntariness, ito ay human acts. Pero hindi rin natin maitatanggi na ang human acts ay may iba't ibang degree ng knowledge, freedom as applied sa action. Kapag ang degree ng knowledge, freedom at voluntariness ay full, ibig sabihin mas mabigat ang responsibility mo. The first one is ignorance. Ito ang dapat nating tandaan, one cannot be excused for reasons of innocence out of ignorance. Ano nga ba ang ignorance? Kamangmangan, kawalan ng alam sa aspeto ng bagay. Ano naman ang pagkakaiba ng pagiging ignorante sa pagiging inosente? Ignorance is defined as the absence of knowledge in a person who is required to know what he does not know. Ano naman ang innocence? It means the absence of knowledge in person who is not required to know what he does not know. Ano nga ba ang mga halimbawa nito? Pag ang bata di pa marunong magluto ng kare-kare, inosente yun, pero pag ikaw na di pa marunong magsaing, ignorance yun. Kaya huwag masyadong pabibo pag di ka pa marunong magsaing. Another modifier of human acts is what we call concupiscence. Ano nga ba ang ibig sabihin nito? Ang salitang concupiscence ay katumbas ng salitang passions, also known as instinctual drives. Pag sinabi nating passions, it belongs to man's sensory appetites rather than to man's intellectual appetites. They refer to the emotions and feelings of man in relation to his actions. Since emotions and feelings belong to man's sensory appetites, they are in themselves irrational. Concupiscence or what we call passion are defined as appetites towards the possession of good and avoidance. Instinctual drives. Kusang bumubukal, kusang lumalabas like galit at selos. Di mo naman pinipilit na magselos, di ba? Or sabihin mong, bukas, magagalit ka sa kanya. These are emotional drives attached to certain things. Kahit sabihin mong di ka nagseselos, di ka magseselos, pero bakit ganon? Yung pakiramdam na di naman kayo at walang kayo pero parang apektado at dehado ka kapag may kasama siyang iba. Masakit yun, di ba? Joy is another example that may affect your acts. Example, sa sobrang saya mo, naglulundag ka hanggang nasira ang mga gamit sa bahay dahil nanalo ka sa paraffle ni Mayor. Sa love naman, halimbawa, sa sobrang pagmamahal mo, nagagawa mo ang mga bagay na di mo naman kayang gawin dati. Halimbawa, ang tapang mo kapag may aso lalo na at nandyan yung girlfriend mo na dati namang takot ka sa aso. Bigla ka na lang naging, lalaki ako. Atapang ay tao. Isa pang halimbawa, natagpuan mo ang asawa mo na may kasamang iba sa kwarto. Ouch! Kumuha ka ng baril, nagdilim ang paningin mo at binaril mo sila. Bang! Napatay mo silang dalawa, and they rest in peace joyfully and satisfied together. Crime of passion or crime of concupiscence ang tawag doon. Another modifier of human acts is fear. What is fear? Takot ka ba? Takot ka bang malaman niya na may lihim kang pagtingin sa kanya? Di wow! Naaapektuhan ng takot ang mga ginagawa natin. What is fear? It is the shrinking of the mind on account of an anticipated evil or threat. The emotion that catch impending or anticipated evil and manifest itself to avoid or escape from an impending threat. Naapektuhan pa rin ng takot ang mga kilos natin. Example, takot ka sa daga, ngayon nandun ka sa third floor ng building. Sa sobrang takot mo sa daga, sumampa ka sa gilid ng pader. Sa sobrang takot mo, dahil tumalon ang daga, napatalon ka rin. Tumalon ka rin sa building. Gumana ba ng malaya ang iyong knowledge, freedom at voluntariness sa pagtalon mo sa building? Kung wala ang daga, tatalon ka ba sa building? Dahil sa fear, nagawa niya ang bagay na yon. It means, fear can modify human acts. Actions that proceed from fear are those that are performed because of fear. It is fear that causes or moves the agent to perform them. Doing things from fear, yung example natin kanina about daga. Actions that proceed with fear are those that are performed with fear as the accompanying elements. Doing things with fear, example, takot ka sa heights pero sumakay ka pa rin sa Ferris wheel. The next modifier of human acts is violence or force. What is violence? This is an external action done with force. Halimbawa, habang naglalakad ka sa kahabaan ng Alunan Avenue, hinarang ka at tinutukan ng kutsilyo ng mga bashers mo at biglang may ganap. Kahit palasimba ka to defend yourself, in short, nasaksak mo sila. The actual application of force to a person by another for the purpose of compelling him to do something against his will. If violence is a threat, then it is not violence at all but fear. So, when an agent does an act due to threat of violence, the responsibility of the agent should be judged according to the criteria of fear and not of violence. Take note mga besh, no matter how violently a person may be treated, his will always remains free, for physical forces can never reach the intrinsic act of the will. Physical force can compel a person to do something but cannot compel a person to will something. Another modifier of human acts is habit. Mga nakagawian. Paano nga ito nakakaapekto sa human acts? Halimbawa, yung palamura mong friend, nakagawian niyang magmura. Masama ang pagmumura, di ba? Alam natin yan. Minsan nasa simbahan kayo ng kaibigan mong palamura, may mga moment na masyadong tahimik like during communion at biglang nahulog yung luhuran at dahil doon, biglang napamura ang kaibigan mo sabay sigaw with proper punctuation ng PI. Ang tanong, fully aware ba siya sa ginawa niya? Ang freedom at voluntariness niya ba ay full? Habit is defined as a constant and easy way of doing things acquired by the repetition of the same act. Tendencies we have developed in ourselves from repeated acts. This helps us to determine the degree of responsibility. To the extent a person has been taken over by a particular habit, that person has a decreased amount of responsibility for what he is doing. However, an individual is bound to avoid becoming entrenched in bad habits and is obligated to try to replace them with good habits. There are two kinds of habits by the way. These are virtue at vices. Virtue pag good habits. Pag bad habit naman, vices. Virtuous ang tawag sa taong nagpa-practice ng good habits. Vicious naman pag bad habits ang pina-practice mo. Ang virtue mo ay nakakapekto sa mga actions mo at minsan ay naaabuso rin. Sa vices naman, pag bisyo na, may kahandaan na ang katawan mo, hindi mo na iniisip na ito ay masama. Kahit di na maganda, nagagawa mo pa rin kahit di mo na pinag-iisipan. Yung nararamdaman mo sa kanya, bisyo na ba yon? Char lang. Habit affects our reflection, yung mga pagninilay sa mga bagay na dapat mong gawin. Naiintindihan mo na ba? Ang tanong, nakasubscribe ka na ba sa channel na ito? Kung di pa, galaw-galaw na dyan.